I'm Mary Elizabeth Moore. I'm the Dean of the School of Theology, and I was invited to do a welcome, which of course is silly when most of you have been here all afternoon doing hard work, good work. But I want to make an observation that within this room, certainly not more than a handful of people, and perhaps not even that, have not been affected by the psychic injury and our moral injury of war. And when you think about the societal injury that has been spoken about today, not one of us has been untouched by that injury. Another observation is that every single voice in this room is necessary to find our way through to alternative options to war and to the cultivation of war as the only or the best or the first alternative when dealing with crises. You've proven that by what you've said both from the panel and from the whole group, so thank you. So welcome. Welcome from distant lands across the world. Welcome from communities throughout Boston and throughout New England. Welcome to people who study in multiple disciplines across multiple scholarly communities and who do activist work and therapeutic work in multiple institutions and with multiple concerns. As we've heard the panel this afternoon, 3 themes jump out at me, and I'm going to name them briefly. Cover up. The covering up of moral injury. And the covering up of the cover-up and the covering up of the cover-up. Secondly, uncovering. The analysis this day has penetrated deeply into the uncovering of moral injury and the social, psychological, political factors that contribute to it, that make it possible and that feed it. There is no bottom to this pit. And the only way for us to address this pit is to join together in this analysis of uncovering. And finally, moral responsibility, which can only be taken when we see what's uncovered, because otherwise it's just a little of this and a little of that, and that too requires all of us. So thank you for being here, for contributing what you've contributed, and for contributing what you're going to continue to contribute as we go through this conference time. Special thanks to CGS for co-sponsoring this with the School of Theology, and to Shelley Rambo and Barbode Salimi, who've done an absolutely fabulous job of planning and hosting it.
Thank you, Dean Moore, for those words. The way you encapsulated what we are up to here, as it were, is really profound and touching for me. And just a quick note, Dean Moore does not have a light schedule, so the fact that you're here is really profound, and thank you so much for being here, for those welcoming words. I have the privilege of introducing the main event, as it were. Mr. David Wood is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has covered war and conflict around the world for more than 35 years. His second book, What Have We Done? The Moral Injury of Our Longest Wars, was published by Little, Brown & Co. in late 2016. This work is based on his deep reporting in Iraq and Afghanistan and on veterans after they return. Recently, the book was awarded the prestigious Dayton Literary Peace Prize for nonfiction in 2017, an incredible honor. Mr. Wood's series on severely wounded veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, which explored advances in battlefield trauma medicine and what that has meant to those who fall in battle, won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. He has been a journalist since 1970 a staff correspondent successively for Time Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, Newhouse News Service, the Baltimore Sun, and AOL's Politics Daily. For 6 years, he was the senior military correspondent for HuffPost. A birthright Quaker and former conscientious objector, he covered guerrilla wars in Africa as Time Magazine's Nairobi bureau chief from 1977 to 1980. As a Washington-based correspondent since 1980, Mr. Wood has reported on national security issues at the White House, Pentagon, and State Department, and has covered conflicts in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Central America. For more biographical information, please visit his website, davidwoodjournalist.com. Please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. David Wood.
So, can you all hear me okay? It's okay if I walk around, can you all hear me? No?
There's a hand, do you want the handheld mic?
Sure.
Just right back there, just flip it to off.
How's that? Okay. Somebody said this afternoon, this is sort of an intimidating crowd, and nobody could be more intimidated than I, because my academic career ended when I flunked out of college as a junior. So let's just, I'm gonna lower the academic temperature a little bit here, if you don't mind. But I think I can contribute something to our talking about moral injury. And let me just tell you a little bit about where I come from. So I did grow up as a Quaker, went to Quaker Sunday school, and the interminable silent meetings for worship. As a kid, there could be nothing worse. But we did study in Sunday school, we studied Gandhi and nonviolence, and so I got a thorough grounding in that. My family was we were not active pacifists, but we were sort of gentle pacifists. And I think my mother carried that tradition through. At age 85, she was out on Route 1 north of Philadelphia in her wheelchair with a candle and a sign that said, "Stop the war." So that was good. When I was about 10, our family hosted one of the Hiroshima Maidens. And these were women who had been schoolgirls at the time that we dropped the atomic bomb on them. So about 10 years later, they were brought to the United States for plastic surgery. I think it was the Quakers that paid for this and organized it, but I'm not really sure. But one of them stayed in our house for a couple of weeks before her surgery. And so the first person I knew who was had any experience directly in war wasn't a proud warrior in a splendid uniform and gleaming medals and cool weapons and stuff, but it was a schoolgirl my country had tried to incinerate. And that made a pretty big impression on me. So when I turned 18, I registered as a conscientious objector and then served 2 years of alternate service instead of going to the military. And then I became a journalist, and within a few years was a foreign correspondent, was sent to Africa, and the story there that Time Magazine wanted me to report on were all the wars of national liberation that were going on across the continent. So you can't imagine anybody more spectacularly unprepared to be a war correspondent than a white kid from a safe suburb and grew up in a Quaker family. But anyway, I got through it thanks to the kindness of strangers. So I want to talk about wartime and moral injury, and the lens through which I want to talk about that is through the people that I've spent most of my time with over the last 35 years or so, and that is the working class military. So these are the young, mostly enlisted, mostly male people that we send to war. and if I refer to them as guys, I mean men and women, but they're mostly men. And the reason why I know these people so well is that when I was in Africa, and for about 15 years after that, I worked as an independent reporter out on the battlefield, which just meant when there was a war, I went and figured out where the fighting was and went and reported on that and figured out how to send my stories back and how to get back home. So I didn't have a bureau, I didn't have a security detail or a driver or a translator or anything like that. It was just me. When it got to the war in Bosnia, something had changed, and I felt like I was a target. Actually, I know I was a target. There were people gunning for me in that war. Up until that point, as a journalist, we sort of enjoyed immunity from everything. We just were sort of spectral other people out there. But by the time Bosnia came around, and I spent a lot of time in Mostar, and it was the scariest thing I've ever done. And so after that, I just worked as an embedded journalist. I had discovered, when I got back from Africa in 1980, I started covering the Pentagon. And so I was one of the Pentagon press corps. And I had a desk at the Pentagon. And I traveled everywhere with the SecDef. And it was really cool for about 6 months. And then it started to get really repetitive and boring. And I discovered the military is out there. I mean, I didn't discover it, I realized they're out there all the time doing what they do. And so I called them up and I said, hey, can I come out with you guys? I'm kind of bored here. And they were like, sure, if you want to. And I said, yeah, I want to. So I started embedding myself with mostly ground troops, so Army soldiers and Marines, but also with on ships and like air crews. And so I spent a lot of time away from Washington, either covering wars or out with the military, embedding myself in whatever they were doing. And when they went to war, I went with them. So that's sort of the background. One of the things that I learned from them is to disbelieve the canard that there are no atheists in foxholes. First of all, there are no foxholes anymore. Those are gone. They're called fighting positions, and people rarely use them anymore because the fighting is so fluid and goes so fast that you don't really dig defensive positions anymore. But the bigger point is that I haven't come across, in all the times that I've spent it as an embedded reporter with U.S. military units, there's not a lot of active religion that goes on there. There are chaplains around, and they're kind of fun guys to hang out with because they're not in the chain of command. So, if you're a Marine private, you can joke around with the chaplain. You can't joke around with the staff sergeant because he has life or death power over you. So chaplains were okay to hang around with, but they weren't a big help in any situation, and especially when something bad happened. The chaplain would call everybody together and you'd have a kumbaya moment. And the guys I hung out with were just like, it was kind of screwed up, it didn't really help. So, but there are those moments in war, in the most unlikely moments, when there are moments of incredible spirituality. And so for myself, this happened when I was in Afghanistan in 2002. So it was January 2002. It was right after the Special Forces had chased the Taliban out of power. It was before there was a big buildup of U.S. conventional troops. And I flew in there with some guys from the 10th Mountain Division at Fort Drum, New York. We flew into Afghanistan, and it was pretty austere. We tacked up a couple of plywood latrines, and we ate cold rations, and there was no hot water, no running water. And so I spent some time there. And one of the interesting things was that so at Bagram in Afghanistan, former Soviet air base, big long runway. All the buildings were on one side of the runway, and they were mostly destroyed because there'd been a lot of fighting back and forth, and you know, people would attack, and then the other side would run, and then they'd re-attack, and so back and forth over 15 or 20 years, the place was pretty well shot up, and there were a lot of landmines around. But on the far side of the runway, there was nothing except a U.S. military forward observation post. And I was like, wow, I wonder what it's like out there. So one night I went out there to hang out with those guys, and they were basically looking out at the Shamali plain from which, there were bad guys out there. And so their job was to, keep an eye on things and make sure nobody snuck up on the base. Well, it wasn't a smart idea for me to go out there because it was really boring. There was nothing going on. And so I was feeling sort of sorry for myself. And in the middle of the night, this guy comes crawling along and in a U.S. military uniform. And he crawls up to me and he says, "You want to take communion?" I was like, sure, Quaker kid, I'd never taken, I wasn't really sure what communion was. But he had a gold cross on his collar, so I figured this was probably okay. So he popped open his canteen cup, and there was wafers and wine in there, and he took out a stole, is that the right word? Put it around his shoulders and put his hand on my head, or on my helmet. Can't remember if I took my helmet off, I probably should have. And he said a prayer, and then I took communion. And I'll never forget this. This was the most powerful thing I had ever experienced. It was like being connected straight into the elemental force of the universe. It felt like, and you got to realize this was a dangerous, lonely, scary kind of place. And I felt like I was in the hand of God. That's what it felt like. And so there are those moments like that, and I think, people do experience those kinds of things. So while there's not a lot of formal religion, there is that kind of background that's out there. So I want to take a drink of water, excuse me. Are you sure you can't hear me like this?
Yeah.
So I want to talk about killing and forgiveness, because killing, after all, that's what the military is there for. It's the only mission the military really has, and it is either directly killing people or threatening to kill people. And so everybody in the military is part of that mission. It doesn't matter what your specific job is. What you're there for is to kill people. In order to understand this whole business of killing and forgiveness, we got to go to boot camp. Not literally, but but how many people here have been to boot camp or basic training? Okay, so you guys know what I'm talking about. I've been through boot camp, through Marine boot camp, and I've also been to Army boot camp as a visitor many, many times. And so what it looks like is a bus pulls up, and it's probably 2 o'clock in the morning, and kids stumble off the bus, and they might have been on the bus for 10 hours because, they came all the way from some little town in Wisconsin, and the bus came along picking up people at recruit depots, and, they get off the bus at Parris Island, South Carolina at the Marine boot camp. And the lights are glaring at them, the drill sergeants are yelling, and it's always confusion and scary and weird, and they're pretty freaked out. And one of the things that the drill sergeants do is say, count off by twos. 1, 2, 1, 2. You two guys are battle buddies. You are responsible for each other no matter what. No matter what. And I've seen this over and over again. Everybody is going, yeah, right, okay, we got that. On to, they're getting their uniforms, they're being shoved into the barracks, they're being yelled at. And they don't really take that to heart. And the next day they go out on the obstacle course, and a kid who's a little overweight can't get up over the wall, and the drill instructor drops the entire unit to do push-ups on hard gravel because you screwed up, told you were responsible no matter what, and you let him fail. So the next day, they help him up over the obstacle course. So from that little seed grows this, by the time these guys get into combat, that little seed, you're responsible for your buddy no matter what, has grown into this unconscious, total devotion to each other that they don't ever really think about. Like I say, it's unconscious. It's part of who they are. They are responsible for each other no matter what, right? So I learned this. I once embedded in a Marine battalion for a year, and it was a great experience. When I came back, my family was like, "You forgot how to eat politely, and you can't talk like that around us." But one of the things I learned was you're responsible for your buddy no matter what. So in this year that I spent with the Marines, we trained up for a year, and then we went to Somalia. And there was a lot of bad stuff. It was a hard couple months in Somalia. And then we came back and stopped in Spain at Rota for liberty, and so they could refit the ship and all that stuff. And so I went out drinking with a bunch of Marines. And so one of the Marines was not my official battle buddy, but he was somebody who I spent a lot of time with, and when we got in firefights and stuff, he made sure I was okay, and I sort of watched over him, and it was sort of an informal. He was my best friend there in the Marine Battalion. And he was a great combat Marine, and he wasn't so good when he wasn't in combat. He was a troublemaker, and he got in trouble all the time. And I knew, so we drank a lot, and it got to be pretty late, and we had to get back to the ship in order to meet curfew. And I said, "Hey, Staff Sergeant, we gotta go." And he goes, I'm not gonna use his language, but he said, "I ain't going back there. Screw the Marine Corps." And I said, "Come on, Norm, we gotta go. We gotta get there." And he goes, "I'm not going." So I carried him back to the ship. He was really drunk. And the next day he said, "How did I get back last night?" I said, "I carried you." He goes, "Wow, that's really something." And I thought, that is, I never would have done that as a civilian. I was really picking up on this, you're responsible no matter what, no matter what. It's such a important thing in the military and totally unknown, I think, pretty much in civilian society, right? So I want to tell you about a guy I know named Patrick. Patrick came to me a couple of months ago. He said, "I read your book, and I want to talk to you." And I said, "Okay, I want to listen." So it took a long time for his story to come out, but the story was this. Patrick was a special force. He was in the Army Special Forces. He was an officer, and with many, many combat tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he commanded a hunter-killer team in Afghanistan on his last tour. And their job was, when they get a list of bad guys from higher headquarters, and then they go find those guys and kill them. That's what they did. And they were good at it. And that was okay with them because they were bad guys because higher said they were bad guys. So that's the way that went. But one day he got a different mission, and the mission was, what higher said was, "There's a village about 40 clicks from where you are, and the Taliban just overran the place, and we need you to go take it back." So I was like, okay. So he and his guys went to look at this village, and they're overlooking from the hills down into the village, and they can see Taliban there, a lot of Taliban, and a lot of women and children, and no military-age males, or mams in parlance. In other words, all the males had fled, or either to join the Taliban or join the army or just get out of the way, and it was just women and children and Taliban. So how to take this place back is a tactical question. Two ways to do it, really. And this is him telling me this story. He could either take his guys and they'd ride right into town in their up-armored Humvees and just start shooting and kill as many Taliban as they could, and they figured they could take the town back that way. And they would probably kill some civilians. But they'd also take heavy casualties themselves. And he figured between a third and a half of his guys would become casualties, dead or wounded. Or he could call in airstrikes and artillery strikes and level the place and go in afterwards. So what to do? You know, here's one of those things that's an acute moral dilemma to which there's no good answer, right? So they called in airstrikes and they leveled the place. Killed all the Taliban, killed a lot of other people, and the next morning they went down into town, and there were people, survivors were loading bodies in the back of the truck, and they looked in the back of the truck and it was body parts of women and children. So, Patrick obviously shattered by this. A lot of what we've heard today is people making bad decisions or people doing bad things. This doesn't fall in that category. It wasn't a bad thing that he did. It would have been bad either way, right? But the value that he operated under was, you're responsible for your buddies no matter what. You know, does that mean killing women and children? Yeah, it does. So those are the rules under which we send people out into war, and that's, you know, they've got to make those decisions. But what really haunted him and made him furious was he carried the burden of that responsibility, right? He made that decision. It wasn't his guys, you know, he was the commander. It wasn't his immediate hire, who was probably some major, you know, in the Special Forces Command back in Kabul or wherever. It wasn't him. He just said, take the village. He didn't say how to do it. He didn't have to carry the moral burden of having killed those women and children. It wasn't anybody at the Pentagon. It wasn't anybody in Congress or the president. They probably didn't even know about this. And it certainly wasn't any of us, because we for sure didn't know about it. So the question is, who forgives Patrick? Where does forgiveness come from? And what do you forgive him for? Not what do you forgive him for, but what is he forgiven for? What was it that he did that was so wrong? You know, this is where I stumble when I start thinking about forgiveness and spirituality in warfare. So often, the moral injury comes not from something you did that was demonstrably bad. It comes from an impossible moral dilemma that you're put into, and no matter what you decide, it's going to be bad. How would he have felt if he'd said, you know, me and my guys are going to go in and take that place, and he'd had 10 of his guys killed? You know, that would have been bad. So when I think about this, you know, I thought a little bit about how the church, and I guess by that I mean organized religion, really hasn't been much help here. Really not much help. So it's interesting that the early Christians were so militantly, angrily pacifist, if I could put those words together. I mean, they were like, no compromise, you know, no violence, nothing. And that was kind of admirable, but clearly the church couldn't sustain that. And so then we have sorry, I got to look at my notes. Constantine, sorry, I'm not a scholar. I told you I was going to lower the intellectual level here. So we have Constantine sees the cross in the sky, and in this sign you shall conquer, and going to war on a religious basis became a thing. So much so that then we have Ambrose and St. Augustine developing the just war doctrine, and on and on. So let's talk about just war doctrine for a little bit, because again, I think this has interesting relevance to the people that I've gone to war with on the battlefield. And to do that, I want to talk about a guy named Joey Schiano. Those of you who've read the book, I apologize, his story's in the book, but let me tell it again really briefly. So Joey Schiano was part of a battalion that I went to Afghanistan with as an embedded reporter, and the way that worked was, and this is pretty typical of the way I operated, I went to Camp Lejeune and I spent weeks and weeks and weeks with them as they trained up to go to Afghanistan, and then we all flew to Afghanistan and I spent a couple of months with them there. So I got to know them pretty well. So Joey Schiano this was his second combat tour, and he was probably at that point 21. Not terribly tall, maybe about this, shorter than me, and blonde hair, but the thing was he had rosy cheeks, and that was what had made him seem like everybody's little brother, and that's the way the Marines treated him. They loved Joey Schiano. And so Joey wanted more than anything to be called Joseph, because he thought that was more grown up and more serious, befitting a combat Marine. And so the Marines all called him Joey, and he hated it. And I asked one of the Marines one time, how come you're calling him Joey? He hates that. And this Marine said, the people we love, we make fun of, and the people we don't love, we never talk to them. So, little insight into Marine culture. So the story about Joey Schiano centers on a situation in which he and his Marines were in a firefight with the Taliban, a pretty typical situation in which the Taliban were holed up in an adobe farm compound, so a long building with walls, and the Taliban firing out of the little firing ports, and the Marines were pinned down, and they couldn't attack and they couldn't leave, and the situation was just getting bad. And so they called higher, and they said, okay, we're kind of stuck here, but we have a SMAW. The SMAW, S-M-A-W, is a shoulder-mounted anti-tank weapon, a bazooka, right? You know what a bazooka shoots a rocket. And the Marines said, so can we use the SMAW? Because we're out of other options. And higher said, yeah, go ahead, use the SMAW. So Joey Schiano was the SMAW gunner. And so he took a bead on this building and fired the rocket, and it blew apart one end of the building and collapsed into rubble. And the Taliban fled, and the Marines interpreter said they want to bring out their wounded. So okay, they bring out their wounded, and they're all women and children who have been herded into that end of the building as human shields. The problem with human shields is you got to know they're there. The Marines had no idea. And Joey, having no idea that he was killing women and children by doing that, was totally shattered and sank to his knees sobbing, and it was quite an ordeal for all of them. So Joey finished out his deployment, came back home with a bunch of other Marines from that battalion, got out of the Marine Corps because they'd finished their 4 years. And Joey came home to Connecticut and tried to figure out what to do with his life. And clearly after that, pretty hard to settle on a civilian career or to do anything interesting. And so he was sort of floundering. He called the VA, and the VA said, we're kind of busy, can you call back in 6 to 8 weeks? And he never did. And then on a sunny Sunday afternoon, his car went off the road, hit a tree, and he was killed. When the cops came to his mother's house to tell them what had happened, she was lying down. She wasn't feeling well. She was lying down. And after they left, she lay there for a while, and then she got up and went into the kitchen and smashed every bit of glassware and crockery she could get her hands on. She was just furious that she had given her son, as she saw it, to the government, and they had killed him. So Barack Obama had declared the war in Afghanistan a just war. And I sometimes imagine Barack Obama sitting down with Joey Schiano's mother, and the ghost of Joey Schiano maybe, and saying, what exactly? You know, this was a just war, so the Ten Commandments don't enter into it. Killing was justified. Don't worry about it. I mean, what would he have said? And Barack Obama probably could have come up with something good, but still the point is, what does just war have to do with that situation? And what was the moral choice that Joey Schiano had? Really not much. One of the things that I stumbled across when I was doing the research for this book was the practice of some civilizations and societies to have ceremonies, rituals of cleansing and forgiveness, which is such a cool idea. And you know, some of the church people cottoned onto this in the Middle Ages when they decreed that if you had gone to war, you had to do a certain amount of penance. So I think 1066, Battle of Hastings, I think the bishop said, you know, if you killed somebody at battle, you had to do 40 days of penance. And my favorite, you know, if you didn't know how many people you killed, you had to do 1 week of penance a year for the rest of your life. And some of the penance things were pretty severe, you know, crawling into church and wearing a hair shirt and all that kind of humiliating stuff. And then even today, there are societies that recognize that when you send people to war, bad things happen, and there has to be some accounting for that, and there has to be some, you know, like a ritual of cleansing and forgiveness. So I thought about that when I want to tell one more quick story, and then we can break for questions. And this story is about a young Marine named Nick Rudolph. And again, he's in the book, so if you read this already, I apologize. But so Nick Rudolph, really nice kid, combat Marine, 2 deployments. He was with this battalion I went with in Afghanistan. And he's a little taller than I am, and he's one of these kids that's a little bit awkward, so he's always kind of stumbling over his feet. Really nice kid, thoughtful, and just, you know, like so many of the kids we send to war, just an admirable person. So Nick was in a firefight, again, Taliban holdup in a farm compound, Marines pinned down. And at one point he sees somebody coming around the corner of the building, shooting at him and his fellow Marines, and he gets that person in his sights and realizes that's like a 13-year-old kid, and shoots him dead. So, you know, I've been back and forth over this story trying to find where is the moral fault here? Because, for one thing, that's what the military calls a good kill, right? I mean, clearly the person shooting at Nick and his Marines was a combatant. Under all the rules of engagement and the Pentagon's big, thick manual on the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions and all that kind of stuff, nowhere does it talk about the age of a combatant. In Nick's mind, he killed a child. That's how he thinks about it. And you could even say this was a moral choice that he made because he's defending his fellow Marines, were the people he loves most in the world, that unconscious, total devotion. And, you know, you're responsible for your buddies no matter what. Does that mean killing a child? Yes, it does. That's pretty hard stuff. So about 5 years after we all came back from Afghanistan, I got some of these Marines together. And we did this a couple of times where I'd rent some hotel rooms and buy a whole lot of beer, like a whole lot of beer. And we'd sit around and swap stories, and I'd just let my tape recorder run. And on one of those occasions, I said to Nick, hey, would you tell the story about shooting the kid? Because I'm not sure I remember it correctly. For one thing, when something like that happens, and that kind of thing happened a lot in these wars, there's no time to really, really think about it. When Nick shot that kid, and I wasn't there at the time, I was in a different place, and I said, so what did you do after you shot the kid? He was like, well, we policed up the weapon and went chasing the Taliban. I mean, it was just like gone, because that moment was gone. And so anyway, I said to Nick, tell that story again, and let's talk about it. So he told the story, and when he was finished, in this hotel room in Philadelphia, and it was a gray day, and it was late afternoon, so it was sort of getting dark, and we were sitting there in the gloom, and I wanted to say words of forgiveness. So I felt so bad for Nick, because here it was 5 years later, and he was still really conflicted as he choked up when he was telling the story. And so I wanted to say, it was war, you couldn't help it. It was the kid's fault. And bad things happen in war. And, and luckily, I couldn't think of exactly what to say. And one of the Marines there said something that I have come to see as the perfect words of forgiveness. And what he said was, yeah, that was fucked up. And I thought, that's perfect. That was fucked up. And I apologize for the language, but this is, again, these are the kids we send into combat. And it's perfect because it recognizes, and this is so critical to forgiveness and a piece we often overlook, it recognizes that bad things were done. Okay, you really can't unring that bell. A kid was shot. Joey Schiano killed a bunch of women and children. And Patrick leveled a whole village full of women and children. Those things are bad. They're just objectively evil, right? But notice in that phrase, that was fucked up, it was, first of all, there's no blame attached. It just was. It's not like you did this or they did this, it just was. And then it was, not is, was not that is fucked up, it was. It's a discrete event and it's over, and we're still here because we love you. That's the critical piece. And I think this is reflected in some of the therapies that have been developed to deal with moral injury. The same kind of thing, but this is like Marine therapy, right? Yeah, that was fucked up. And it's just perfect. So the thought I want to leave you with is, the reason why I called my book, What Have We Done? Because I feel really strongly that we bear moral responsibility for sending these people into combat, and we never tell them what's going to happen. And the military, of course, never tells them what's going to happen. There's no preparation for those, what do you do when a child is shooting at you? You don't learn that in the military. They leave it up to you, and then when you make that decision, you've got to live with it. And again, these decisions are made, in a heartbeat. So I think it's important that we listen to the stories of veterans, that we make ourselves accessible to hear what their experiences are, and to listen with validation, which is a term I learned, which is basically like Marine forgiveness. It's like acknowledging that something bad was done and recognizing that it was done in the past, that there was no good answer, and that we're still here, we love you. You know, those things are so important. While we're listening to their stories, I want you to bear in mind that not all their stories are horrific like that, but they're all sort of incandescent in the sense that the experiences that grunts have at war are so intense that and so divorced from the reality of what we live in civilian society, they can't really tell those stories to anybody who wasn't there. And I feel really privileged that they talk to me because I spent a lot of time there, and they sort of trust me, and they know that I won't run screaming when they tell the story about killing a child or like Patrick leveling this village of women and children. And we all know veterans, or we all know, Grandpa went to war and he came back, he never talked about what he'd been through, never talked about it. And when he died, we went up in the attic and he had a box full of medals. We didn't even know he won medals. That's such a common story. Veterans don't talk about what they've been through because how could they? Nick told me, people come up to me all the time and say, thank you for your service. And I want to say, I killed a child. Is that what you're thanking me for? Because you don't really know what I did. So we have to make ourselves, again, accessible to hearing their stories. And I just want to end on this note. As I said, not all the stories are bad and horrific. And one of the stories that on this afternoon when I was sitting there drinking beer with these Marines, after we all got back from Afghanistan, somebody said, hey, Nick, tell the story about the Christmas tree. And I was like, this is going to be good. And this again happened when I wasn't there. But so the story of the Christmas tree was that it was Christmas Eve, and the chaplain had caused a Christmas tree to be put up on top of the Connex boxes. So Connex boxes are the big steel shipping containers, like the back half of tractor trailers, that the Marines shipped all their stuff to Afghanistan in, and then emptied them out, and then stacked them up to make sort of a stockade and some of their forward operating bases. So these Connex boxes were stacked 3 high, and the chaplain's Christmas tree was on the top. Electric lights and decorations, and it was a beautiful tree, and the chaplain was really proud of this tree. And first sergeant came around, and he said to Nick and his guys, see that Christmas tree up there? I want that in the first sergeant's tent tonight. And they're like, first sergeant, that's the chaplain's Christmas tree. And he goes, I don't care whose tree it is, I want it in our tent tonight. So they're like, okay, now remember that Marines are in the chain of command under the first sergeant, right? First sergeant is like God. And the chaplain's, a nice guy, but they don't answer to him. So Nick and his buddies climb up in the dead of night to the top of the Connex boxes. They snip the wires, they unplug the electric lights, and are starting to hand the tree down when the chaplain arrives. And he's like, hey, what are you guys doing? And they're like, oh. And a bunch of the Marines are dropping off the back of the Connex boxes, and there's Nick caught in the glare of this, the lantern. And the chaplain goes, who are you, and what unit are you with? What's your name, Marine? And he goes, Rudolph, sir. And the chaplain is like, are you telling me your name is Rudolph and you're stealing my Christmas tree on Christmas Eve? I don't believe it. So that was the funny story they told. And again, I'm glad you're laughing because some of these stories you had to be there, but so not all their stories are bad, but we need to listen to all of them. So thank you. I'd love to hear your questions and comments, please.
Thanks, that was great. Matt Lewis, Emery. I was curious if you have to hold in tension that enormous, that trust that these men give you, that the access point and the time spent, you know, downfield and the time spent drinking beer in the hotel, you have to hold in tension then stepping into the position of writing about it and how political or polemical you're going to be in what you assess. I think your job is probably a little different than the scholar, but in a way, when did you figure out what your book was going to be about? And is there a way in which you're cautious that you might violate in your assessment of things that trust?
Yeah, good question. So I'm a good listener, and so people confide in me, like Patrick telling me this story about the village he destroyed in Afghanistan. The book, the stories that I've told in print are like 1/100th of the stories that I've heard. Some of the stories are so horrific, I'm just like, okay, there's nobody can understand how this went down. Some of them implicate soldiers in war crimes, you know, which is problematical because that's dangerous for them and for me. So most of the stories that I hear, I don't tell. The ones that I do tell, I tell because they carry a larger point. And so the story of Nick Rudolph shooting the child is such an interesting illustration of the moral dilemma that people face when we send them to war. So I sort of, a long time ago, took it on myself to tell the stories of the people we send to war because most people in America don't know them. And it was sort of like, you know, the faceless Marine or soldier. And I found them so interesting and compelling, each one of them, that and heartbreaking and enraging, infuriating sometimes, that I thought somebody needs to tell their stories. And so that's pretty much the reporting that I've done has not been policy analysis, it's been telling soldiers' stories, Marine stories. And it took me a long time, as it's taken everybody else, to realize what was going on with, you know, looking back on the stories I was telling. I was like, whoa, you know, something's going on here. People are not okay, and they're not, you know, drug addicted, criminal, you know, homeless veterans. They're like good people, like Nick Rudolph, but they're, you know, there's something going on there. So it did take me a long time to figure out that this was moral injury. So does that get at what you're trying to? Yeah. Okay. Come on, folks.
Yeah. So this is a carryover question from the film, because I watched Father Keating put language, the language of redemption, the language of forgiveness. That's obviously language from his tradition and recognizable religious traditions. And then I saw Tom in the film kind of adopt that, but it didn't always resonate. It was like language that somebody else put on it, but I'm not sure that Tom would have naturally used those same categories. And so my question, and this is because I'm a theologian, is what you're talking about, does it need to be called forgiveness? So that's saying, like, if what you're saying is that was just fucked up, that to me is a very different, has a very different trajectory than forgiveness. So it's a big question for me, which is, when are we adopting language that is familiar and that is familiar And when is it kind of efficacious? When is it really doing the work that, like, Father Keating understands it doing work? But if the soldier or the sailor, if they don't understand it, does it need to be called that? Forgiveness or redemption?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm super unqualified to answer it, but let me take a stab at it. The thing about, that was fucked up, but we're still here, is that's a form of, to my mind, that's a form of forgiveness. It's like, we know that bad happened, that you were involved in it, and we're still here because we love you. And, I don't know whether that counts as theological forgiveness, but I think it's pretty close. The key point, though, it seems to me, that was missing in the film, was what happened? What was it that was, and at one point, I think the narrator or somebody says, what were your stories? And boy, did they skim over that. It was like, there was a time when some civilians got killed, or, the rifle shot killed the kid. But they skipped over that dangerous crowd, and you cannot, in my mind, forgive somebody if you don't know what it is that you're forgiving, or if they don't, not going to recognize it. Which is what was so powerful about that moment with Nick Rudolph telling his story about killing a child, and the Marine saying, yeah, that was fucked up. It was total acknowledgement of what happened. And you can't do that unless you enable people to tell their stories. Yeah, I thought that was a flaw in the film, that that never even really came up. But I think that forgiveness can come even from those of us who weren't there and don't really, can't really get the emotional and physical damage that was done. But I think we could try, and we can certainly offer ourselves as willing listeners, and then offer what forgiveness we can. It's so important, especially for all these veterans who are walking around not telling their stories and sort of hold up.
Yeah, I want to kind of confirm, I'm kind of going where you're going, Shelley, in terms of that this is a unique language that they had together that affirmed a reality, something that they shared in the experience, and it connected their relationship. So if we think about moral injury as, I see more overlap sometimes between moral injury and trauma. If you go to this kind of theological anthropology place about the nature of the human experience and this brokenness in the relationship. So between the two of them there, in their cultural frame as males or whatever else was going on for them, they could claim that this was really a fucked up reality that they had participated in and understood and shared that it was past, that there is a moment. There's many different theological frames you can, I would go to a Buddhist place that was then and this is, this is the present moment. But if you stay on the experiential space, here was their language for it, rather than imposing a language on it, that this was their language for it.
Well said. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Mr. Wood. I have a question that you just mentioned that we should give ourselves more access to listen to them, both good things and bad things, but they're not very likely to share their stories unless you have some similar experience with them. So what do you think that we can tackle this problem? Because they maybe don't want to tell you their stories, but we like to help.
Yeah, it's hard. I often say things like, we should listen to veteran stories, and I think to myself, how are we going to do that? Because it's not so easy. I mean, you can't walk up to a veteran and say, tell me the worst thing that happened to you in Afghanistan or Iraq, or as in the film, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you? Bad way to start off, right? But I think we can. And what veterans tell me is come ask me. Just say, look, I didn't go, and I can't possibly understand everything that you went through. But if you can tell me even just a little bit, share a little bit of what your experiences were, I really want to listen. And I'll listen to as long as you want to talk. And that's a beginning. That's the best I could do. It's hard and can be really awkward. I can't tell you the number of people that in the military that I've approached and said, I'm your embedded reporter, and tell me what you do. And they're like, I don't talk to reporters. That happens a lot. But veterans can be prickly, and with reason, because mostly we've ignored their service, and they're not so happy about that. So, but I think if you approach them with humility and patience, that would work. You're welcome.
Hi, David. I just want to thank you for your heartfelt storytelling to us this evening. And I actually wanted to respond to your question about creating a space to hear veterans. And I want us to examine the language that I heard you use about wanting to help the veterans. And it may be worth considering taking a different approach and being open to how the veteran can help you. And I don't know how you'd like to respond to that, but help, as a civilian, help me understand what this war is all about and what do I need to hear from you. Because these are people who have carried a lot of responsibility at a young age and have a strong sense of wanting to protect and defend and help others. So being in the role of receiving help is not often easy. I don't know if you want to say anything about
Yeah,
that.
thanks, Chris. That's a really good point. I think that going to talk to a veteran in the spirit of, I can help you with what's bugging you is really a good way to just squelch that right off the bat. And I think your idea of approaching it with help me understand is really a good one, and thank you for bringing that up. It's a good point.
Yes, thank you for your presentation and for the stories that really represented the moral dilemma that soldiers are in. My question then goes back to the larger question of moral responsibility, and because you've had experience in the Pentagon, I'm curious as to where you see the moral responsibility for these wars lie. You started out talking about the women from Hiroshima, and for an example, it's very disappointing that President Obama did not make public apology when he was there to commemorate the bombings of Hiroshima. So where, and in terms of a public policy level, do we claim responsibility for take responsibility for moral
Yeah,
actions in war?
it's a really good question, but I think it's misplaced. Don't go to the Pentagon to ask about moral responsibility. Look, I mean, there's a lot of smart people in the Pentagon. They're good folks, and we hire them to fight wars. That's what they do, and they think about it a lot, and they think about the best way to do it, and how to avoid civilian casualties, and how to avoid getting into firefights in the first place, so we have all this deterrence theory and everything else. But basically, their job is to fight wars. That's what we hire them to do, and they're good at it. So your question really goes to the White House and the State Department, which are, I mean, the State Department nominally is in charge of peacemaking. And boy, talk about dysfunction. I mean, it's a scandal. So I'm doing a lot of reporting right now on, where is the peace building going on? How come we're still involved in these? How come we can't finish these wars? It's a major, 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 colossal failure of this country. that we can't finish wars. And by that, I don't mean killing everybody in sight. I mean ending the conflict, because there are ways to do that, but we don't do it very well. But it's not the Pentagon. I wouldn't go to the Pentagon, you know. But it's a good question and an important one, and we need to keep talking about it. Otherwise, we keep sending these kids into the, you know, into the conflict. And by the way, something I meant to mention during the panel discussion, but I didn't want to butt in, was a question came up about, you know, don't these kids know what they're getting into? And I got to tell you, one of the most aggravating things that I've come across is, and all the time that I spent at boot camp, or, you know, spending a week there, or interviewing kids who just, you know, signed up to go in the military, and they're like a week or two into, you know, basic training. And I always say, I always ask them whether, I said, you know, you guys are going to be sent to Afghanistan and Iraq. Yeah, probably we will. I said, so does the prospect of going to war, did that make you more eager to sign up, or less eager, or how did that figure into your decision? And inevitably, the answer is, well, I never really thought about it. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So, you know, no, they don't know what they're getting into. And, you know, to expect them to is, you know, of course there are people who sign up to go to war to kill gooks and all that kind of thing, but they don't know what they're getting into either. Anyway, I just want to make that point.
I appreciate your stories. In the examples you gave, it was very much what you said. There were impossible situations where there was no good answer. But there are other scenarios, and I'm just wondering sort of what your responses or your thoughts are on this, where war can degrade someone, so they end up doing things that are really morally repugnant. And one of the big things in the war is military sexual trauma, where they turn on other military members in ways that are really harmful. And that's a kind of moral injury as well, but it's much less sympathetic. You know, it's much less evocative of us idealizing or viewing them all as heroes. It really is one of the essential things that happens in war, unfortunately. So just wondering if you can speak.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I've seen happen when I've deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan with a combat unit, and we're there for, you know, 3 months. And over just that period of time, people that start out being idealistic and really taking to heart, you know, the whole counterinsurgency thing of protecting the people and feeling really good about that, over time that corrodes their own moral compass. And, you know, there's some talk about this in my book, where one of the Marines, I think, stopped, he was, you know, at a roadblock or a checkpoint, and here comes a guy on a motorcycle with two little kids on the back, and their mascara is all smeared, and clearly they're sex slaves. And he says, you know, what are we doing here protecting these people? It's, you know, and I think he says in the book, from that point, you know, our own morals, you know, really degraded. So it's a big problem. And part of it is that the military doesn't, except for, you know, you're responsible for your buddy, then the military doesn't provide a lot of training in how to resist that impulse. And you know, you've seen the, you know, the more egregious outcomes of where soldiers, you know, gratuitously shoot civilians or rape civilians, and all that kind of stuff really does happen. It happens in every war, and we're no better than anybody else on that score. Well, maybe we're a little bit better, but it does happen. And I've seen, you know, people that I thought were pretty good young Americans doing that kind of stuff or falling into that trap. And it starts with, you know, using derogatory terms to describe people of that country. And it goes down from there. It's a real problem. And in the best units, you know, the commanders keep an eye on that kind of stuff and control it and talk about it. But in other units, it just does happen. Yeah. yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you so much for your empathy with all the people who trusted you and told you their stories, and for sharing with us. It's really a treasure. And I would just like to say I don't have a lot of academic prowess either, and I feel a little inarticulate or something with a question that I'm not sure how to raise, or but my heart just stopped in its tracks with, you know, the story of Patrick and the leveling of the village, and must have been agony for him, and just overwhelming, ongoing agony for so many families. And I would just like to say that for me personally, I think it's like it's a moral imperative that our human family, take the crucified people off the cross. That was the phrase of the Jesuit rector in San Salvador, who was slain in 1989 with his 5 brothers and the 2 amazing women that worked at the university. That was his liberation theology and heartfelt take on his responsibility to the poor people in El Salvador that were taking the brunt of the war, overwhelmingly civilian. And so I don't know the answer to that question, and like I really appreciated your like stark honesty when you were describing Patrick's dilemma, and my heart goes out to him. But I just wanted to pause there and say that I hope that beyond one unacceptable solution or another, in that moment, maybe now that time has moved on and the people who know that story have to grieve for everyone involved, maybe out of that grief together, you know, we can find a way so that we won't know that that kind of situation will repeat and repeat and repeat. Thank you.
We have time for one, maybe 2 more questions.
Thank you. Good evening, sir. My name is Sean. I'm currently a midshipman in the Navy ROTC unit here in Boston. I'm a student at Boston College as well. And just jumping off of what you were just speaking about, I'm not joining the military because I want to make war. But currently our nation is in a state of war, and it will most likely continue to be for the next couple of years. And the situation we were just speaking about, Patrick's situation, is I find it a very difficult situation, but currently I'm drawn to the special warfare community and the Marine Corps community while I'm in my training, and that's because I view those as the most intense combative roles. And does that mean that I want to serve as an officer because I want to be put in combat situations where I have to, you know, dispose ordnance on people and possibly result in the deaths of civilians? No. But as long as those situations exist and people have to be making those kinds of moral dilemma decisions, if I'm mentally and physically capable to prepare myself to make those kinds of decisions, that's how I want to commit my service right now. It's not because necessarily I'm okay with the idea of waging war, or I'm okay with the idea of taking innocent lives, but if that's a dilemma that our country faces currently, who am I to pass off that opportunity, or not that opportunity, who am I to pass off that responsibility, that tremendous burden on somebody else? If you could extrapolate on those ideas, if you have any words for a future officer or changes you think you should see in the leadership of our military today.
It sounds like you've thought a lot about this, and good on you for that. It's an honorable profession, and we need, as a private citizen, as a civilian, I think we need people like you in the military to make those kinds of decisions. So, bravo.
Thank you. Last question.
This really isn't a question, it's more or less kind of a response to what was mentioned before. My name's Derek, U.S. Army, been doing it for 12 years, still got a little while longer left. something about it, or is dealing with combat veterans and everything, it's not necessarily that they're wanting help, they're wanting understanding. And the problem dealing with civilians, pretty much almost everyone in here, is that you're quick to judge and quick to shun. Everything that we've had to put up with, there's a lot of bad things that we've had to do or had to see. It's not necessarily, hey, you're a bad person, it's an immoral issue, it happened. I need you to try to learn out in regards to, there's bad people in the world. There's people that want to hurt not just us, but just other people. And they might be within our ranks as well. And try to weed them out and try to understand, it's like, hey, understand where I'm coming from, okay?
Not judging.
No, not saying you were, but it's just, civilians in general are just quick to judge and just focus on the bad real quick. The Marines that were in Afghanistan that threw a puppy off a cliff. I can't remember the name of the prison that happened in Iraq, but it was a long time ago. Those were the quick things we jumped on. But we don't focus on in regards to like the soldiers that jumped on a U.S. naval ship, Comfort, and then went down to South America. We've never seen them talk anything about that. So it's those aspects. It's just, yeah, there's a lot of bad. There's exponentially more good that we do. So that's all I got.
So Derek, it's Derek, right?
Yes, sir.
Do you feel that most civilians think people who have served in the military are bad people? Or,
No.
Okay.
I don't think they think that at all. I don't think they think that at all. It's just that they're quick to think that actions are bad. And they don't look at the context of what happened before, as well as after, as well as the context of the soldier, the unit, and the Army as a whole, and over that entire military community. The big problem that we're seeing today is that there's been a devolution, de-evolve of America between, you have a warrior class and you have a civilian class. And the warriors, we're going to take care of our own. Very, very small percentage of America. But I could go talk to a guy from World War II, and we're brothers like that. But it's hard to talk to a civilian in that aspect.
All right, thanks for speaking up. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your service, and welcome home.
Thank you all for your participation, and please join me in giving a round of applause to Mr. David Wood.